Professor Cook here, and today we're going to walk through part one of our slides on deviance, crime, and social control. So, this is a really interesting topic and really fun chapter to work through. Before we get started with the slides and I move forward, I want to kind of explain why I've got these images on the first title slide here. So all of these images are examples of deviance. Some of these images are examples of crime. So not all of crime is deviant, and not all of deviance is crime, which is a little confusing, but essentially it's just a way to differentiate how we as a society decide who has the authority to sanction people for deviance or crime, and how we attempt to enforce social control. So also deviance is really based on where and when and who is doing it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Before I get too far into that topic, I want to kind of give you what we'll be talking about in this chapter. We'll be talking about deviance, crime, and controlling them. And then we'll go through some sociological perspectives and examples on deviance and crime, mostly functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist. Probably not as much on feminism, although that is covered a bit in your chapter, and it is certainly interesting. But those are the perspectives we'll get to probably in part 2 or 3. This is a bit of a longer lecture for this chapter because there's quite a bit to cover. All right, so what is deviance? Deviance is just any transgression of norms, of socially established norms. So deviance is always socially constructed and enforced by members of society, even if it's informally enforced. When sociologists talk about deviance, we're not making a judgment call. So in other words, we're not saying we think this should or shouldn't be the law or something like that, but we are just simply saying something deviates from the norms. So given that, all of us at one time or another have deviated from the norm. We've broken a norm, whether we've gotten punishment or not. So crime is a little different, but I just want to be clear, it's not necessarily about the seriousness of the offense here. It's more about whether or not that is formally codified into law or whether it is more informal. So informal deviance are kind of those minor transgressions of norms, and formal deviance would be that more specific breaking the law for those of you who know heavy metal from the early 80s. That's a Judas Priest reference. But it's also crime. So formal deviance we could define as criminal. Of course, by saying these are socially constructed, I mean that they're different in different places, different cultures, and based on who is doing them. So let's kind of go back for 1 minute to the pictures on this first slide. So the top two examples are representing formal deviance, or what we would consider crime in today's society. The man with the handcuffs in a suit is sort of meant to allude to the concept of white-collar crime, or crime committed through access by way of one's occupation. So things like embezzlement or fraud or money laundering and things like that. That's white-collar crime, insider trading. We'll talk more about that in detail in a little bit. And then on the top right side, you've got someone, looks like in a ski mask, kind of breaking into some kind of facility. We don't exactly know what's happening there, but this is meant to represent the crime of robbery or theft. And then on the bottom, you've got examples of what we would consider to be informal deviance, right? So you've got this man who looks to be, I don't know, I'm going to say 30, 35, picking his nose. Picking your nose is not against the law. It's gross, maybe, but we would certainly not be trying to send this guy to prison for picking his nose in public. In fact, if you're home alone by yourself, maybe that's less deviant, right? So kind of depending on where you are and how old you are and when this is happening, it's more or less deviant. So if this were a 6-year-old, 5-year-old kid picking their nose, we might not consider that to be as deviant. We would probably say, don't do that, it's gross. But it's not as deviant as a 35-year-old man in a meeting picking his nose. It's interesting in this time of quarantine and social distancing to consider how those informal norms have been established and what counts as deviance now. So if you see people outside and they're not keeping the 6 feet or 10 feet of social distance, we could consider that deviant. And while it is not necessarily illegal, it's certainly against norms. And it's interesting because the governor's mandate about not going to public places is being enforced more rigorously in terms of on nature trails and things like that. And then finally, you've got this young person with the large gauged earlobes. And I think the idea here is that I don't necessarily consider this to be terribly deviant, but it is definitely outside of the norms for how large someone would have gauges, although this is more common. And so you could kind of think about tattoos and the acceptability of displaying tattoos in public as an example of what is constructed as deviance shifting and changing over time. You could also think about the fact that in Colorado, at least, we have legalized recreational use of marijuana. That's still a crime at a federal level, and it's still deviant in some contexts, but most of us accept that as okay and appropriate at this local context. I mean, not at all places and all times, right? And then you could think about cigarette smoking and how that has shifted from once being widely acceptable and now to being quite deviant and quite restricted, and there are laws and rules around that as well. So all of that is a long way of saying that when we talk about deviance, we want to distinguish between informal, which are minor transgressions, so things like picking your nose, not being polite. It might be annoying, but you're not going to go to jail or something like that. And formal deviance, which is crime, which we'll get into. And then we want to add those contexts and those variables of how deviance changes based on who is doing it, where it's happening, and when it's happening. Okay, so how we decide to define and punish deviance creates social order, social control for us. And that's really interesting for sociologists. Like for me, I find the way that people interact online to be very interesting because I see a lot of boundary maintenance and sanctioning happening for certain kinds of online behavior. And what is happening there is basically just a group of people constructing rules for a new technology, right? And so we're all sort of experiencing this now in the era of quarantine and social distancing, where we're having new norms added every day, if you will. Okay, so what was deviant in the past is no longer considered as deviant, and other actions are now considered deviant. So those are all clues to you that that's a social construct. So think of some examples of that. Okay, let me talk about this concept of stigma. This comes from Irving Goffman. And the idea here is that basically deviance can carry with it a social stigma. So deviance can be, usually when we're talking about it, we're referring to a specific behavior. But deviance can also be a trait or a belief. So if you consider maybe what society would expect, and if your traits or beliefs differ or deviate from that, you may have experienced a social stigma. So some examples of this are, especially in past times, teenage pregnancy, right? It's still considered somewhat deviant, but there used to be a much, much worse, I would say, and more judgmental social stigma attached to that. Usually, this is a negative label that devalues that person and also gets in their own head a little bit, changes their concept and their social identity. So on the bottom of this slide, you've got two examples of those jars that you see maybe back before all of this isolation, where people are collecting money to help people with various medical expenses. Now the modern version of this might be a GoFundMe page or something like that. But on the one hand, you see this jar that says, "Please help Joey get a new kidney," and it's full. It's full of cash, so lots of people have donated. So that's indicating that there's not really a stigma for whatever's going on with Joey needing a new kidney. Okay, but on this other side here, you've got a jar that's empty and there's not very much money in it at all, and it says, "Please help, Jamie needs psychiatric care. We're desperate." So what this is illustrating, literally, is that concept of how some illnesses come with a social stigma and some do not. I think that we're getting better about this as a society. We're trying to destigmatize mental health and mental illness, but there's still a stigma there. So that's kind of something to think about. All right. So how do we control deviance? Well, we control it both formally and informally. So a lot of it is controlled through us internalizing our norms in society and our values, so much so that even if we have the option to be deviant, we often will not, because we've got that little voice inside of our head that we think of as maybe our conscience saying, don't do that. That's not appropriate. And then there's sanctions that also prevent us from doing that. We don't want to face the repercussions or the punishment for that deviance, even if it's something we really want to do. So I'll give you an example of this, maybe informal deviance. At one time, quite a while ago, my kids and I were walking home from where they went to school, and on the sidewalk we saw a $20 bill, just $20 laying there. And the kids were very excited, to find that, as you can imagine, unexpected cash. But it was kind of near a house, but not obviously that someone had dropped that money on their way in or out of the house. And so I thought, well, we should just take it. There's nobody around. It wasn't obvious someone had dropped it. But I realized, that it was fairly likely that was the people in the house's money and they had just dropped it walking in or out of their house. And I thought, okay, I have to be a good example for my children, and I don't want to just take this money without checking first, because, well, I also hope I'm a decent person and don't want to just take someone's money. But what I did was I had the kids with me, and I said, all right, what we're going to do, kids, is we're going to go knock on the door, and we're going to ask if someone lost some money and offer it back to them, because that's the right thing to do. And so we did that, and they answered, and they said, no, don't worry about it, go ahead and keep it. And I said, okay, thank you. And I don't know if it was theirs or not, but it was really nice that they let us keep it, and the kids were excited to order unexpected pizza that night. But anyway, the point there is that our behavior was controlled through not wanting to commit an act that, even though it wouldn't have been a crime, I didn't want to set a bad example for my children, and also I didn't want to negatively affect someone else. So that was all informal control over our behavior through socialization that I've experienced throughout my life, and then I'm also socializing my children through that action to prevent deviance. Okay, I hope that made sense. So I want to just briefly touch on Durkheim's theories about social control and how this is kind of getting into that functionalism theory on deviance, and then I'll take a break and we'll do another part of lecture a little bit later. Okay, so for Durkheim, how societies controlled deviance kind of depended on where societies were in terms of modernity. Keep in mind, Durkheim is the theorist who talked about the effects of the Industrial Revolution, the division of labor, and how interdependence of roles led to social cohesion. So he's writing at a time when modernity means early 1900s or the early part of the 20th century. So for Durkheim, he thought that essentially in pre-modern societies, so feudal societies, you had order, you had structure based on what he called mechanical solidarity. Everyone acts the same and thinks the same because you basically just inherit whatever position your parents had. So if everyone's the same, per Durkheim, you don't see a lot of creative deviance, if you will. Punishment is going to be punitive. So if everyone thinks the same and has the same values, there's a really strong collective consciousness. Punishment is punitive and public often, and people are punished for violating kind of society, basically the shared collective consciousness. So you can think about public executions and being a part of pre-modern and feudal times, and that kind of fitting this model. On the other hand, Durkheim said in more quote-unquote modern or advanced societies, you will have organic solidarity where people are interconnected through interdependence. And it's really interesting to think about this again now, thinking about who are our essential workers, right? Who is still working, who needs to show up even during this time of kind of mandatory isolation. We need those folks, right? And so I don't know about if you've seen this or heard this, but every night at 8 o'clock, people go outside their door and scream and howl to thank healthcare workers, right? Indicating their understanding that's a sacrifice and that we need people in those roles. So Durkheim says in a society like this, instead of a punitive punishment when someone breaks norms or laws, you're going to see a rehabilitative focus. So basically, the idea here is if we all need one another performing these different roles, and someone breaks a norm or commits a crime and steps out of those roles, we need to get them back into the normative behavior. So we want to rehabilitate them more than we want to punish them in terms of just vengeance or retribution. Again, this is Durkheim's theory. So the basic concept is in more modern societies where you've got the high degree of specialization through division of labor, because we all need one another, if someone stops performing their role, we're going to want to get them back into that role as soon as possible because we kind of need that person in that particular spot, if you will, in society. So the point of punishment will be rehabilitation. And then in a pre-modern society, the point of punishment will be setting an example and just more of a retribution or punitive focus, maybe even public execution or torture, right? That will happen more in that sort of feudal and pre-modern society. So again, this is a theory based on how societies are organized. And what is kind of interesting for sociologists, and what I often ask you as a class when we're talking about this, is I say, all right, thinking about the criminal justice system in the United States today, thinking about incarceration, mass incarceration, we would fit this definition of a very specialized, quote unquote, modern division of labor in our economic structure, in our society, right, where we're interdependent on one another. But think about whether or not our punishment currently is focused on rehabilitation or it's focused on being punitive and retribution. And most of us agree that it's actually focused more on this punitive aspect. So it's interesting. That's a contradiction per what Durkheim actually predicted. All right, so I will stop here and we'll do another mini lecture soon. Thanks.